Hello and welcome to the Synergy Sessions episode 2. My name is Wayne Reid. I'm a professional officer and social worker at BASWA, the British Association of Social Workers. In this episode, we have special guest appearances from Dr Sue Hollinrake, Heidi and Garfield Hunt from the University of Suffolk. They will take us through a fascinating presentation on their pioneering research on integrating and evaluating anti-racism on the social work course that they deliver. After the presentation, we have a thought-provoking group discussion with the presenters and members of the Black and Ethnic Minority Professional Symposium, or BPS, and also members from the Professional Capabilities and Development Group, the PC D group, and the group discussion is chaired by myself. So sit back and enjoy the episode. I'm really happy to have with me Sue Hollinrake, Heidi and Garfield Hunt, who are from the University of Suffolk. They're going to be delivering a presentation on anti-racism in the east of England, but I'll just come to each of you now. Hello, and if you could just introduce yourselves, please.
Hello everyone, my name's Sue Hollinrake. I was Associate Professor in Social Work until I retired this year, and I'm part of the research team.
Morning everyone, my name is Garfield Hunt. I'm a Senior Lecturer in Social Work at the University of Suffolk and also part of the research team.
Hello, my name's Heidi. I'm a Senior Visiting Research Fellow at the University of Suffolk and also part of the research team.
Great stuff, thank you. And just to explain, I met with Sue at the National Organisation for Practice Teachers conference in 2023, and Sue was delivering a presentation similar to what the group will present shortly. And I was captivated really by the work within the University of Suffolk and the fact that their work on anti-racism predates the murder of George Floyd. And I was really curious as to their motivations really and their achievements around this work. Hence this collaboration. So we're really pleased and excited to hear from you. I'll hand over to you now.
Okay, so lessons learned from how we teach anti-racism on a social work course in the east of England. Dr Sue Hollinrake, Heidi and Garfield Hunt. So I'm just going to introduce very briefly the background to the research, to the two studies. So just a bit of a preamble. The background links to understanding social work students and latterly social work apprentices around their commitment to anti-racist practice, but also to the team, to the university and to placement providers. And what we have looked at is how we develop anti-racist practitioners working in an increasingly complex and changing environment. And for that, we wanted to look at the existing literature and resources around the subject. Knowledge base, we considered research and knowledge production. We have taken a qualitative approach, seeking depth and detail about the lived experiences of learners. We have considered critical race theory as the basis of some of this research. We have considered whiteness studies and white privilege. We have considered difficulties and potential barriers for global majority learners. And alongside those factors, we have had to consider the depoliticization of social work. So the research title for the first study, how much do Black, Asian and minority ethnic students on the social work programme at UOS feel able to explore their different ethnicities within the teaching and learning and assessment opportunities? The aims of the research: to teach more effectively across difference and better manage the integration of Black perspectives into the social work curriculum, involving the student experience more closely. Increase the confidence of Black, Asian and minority ethnic students to consider their cultural heritage and experiences within academic and practice learning. and to positively encourage teaching staff to actively engage in these processes and to improve teaching practice and student experience of this. And here we will acknowledge at the time of the first study we used the term BAME, but our language has since moved on to talk about global majorities. For phase one of the research, this, as mentioned by Wayne, this precedes the death of George Floyd and the relaunching almost of the Black Lives Matter movement. So we were thinking about this way back in 2016. And this is where we undertook an audit of teaching on the programme to improve the teaching content across all modules. In 2017, we held a social work team development day with a consultant to explore staff attitudes and values on the subject. Later that year, we kicked off the small-scale qualitative research project to capture student views of teaching on Black perspectives and anti-racism. And also, just to state here, 2017, at that point, we did not have apprentice social workers on the programme, so the language will have been purely around student experiences. Phase two, we made the decision in 2021, and again, it's timely following lockdown and following George Floyd's death and Black Lives Matter really getting a move again. We made the decision to move to phase two of the research, and we made a funding application and recruited a research associate. Then in 22, we moved to the small-scale qualitative research project to evaluate changes and any progress made from the phase one research and capture student, apprentice and practice educator and tutor views of teaching Black perspectives and anti-racism at the University of Suffolk and within the teaching partnership. Over to Heidi from here.
So, as Garfield said, myself, Garfield and Sue were really curious around. We had noted about 5 years ago that students from the global majorities did not appear to be discussing aspects of their identity, their heritage, their cultural norms and values within lectures and wider group sessions. And as the sense of self, use of self is so integral to social work, we were really curious about what that was about and about whether that was something that we needed to address to support students to get the best teaching and learning opportunities on our programme. So that was kind of the rationale behind the research that we were developing. So we undertook our first phase, and these were the themes that kind of came out of that. So the first one was some stuff around whiteness and white privilege. So there was a clear division between some white students in relation to these issues. Some seemed to take a colourblind approach, seemingly not able to acknowledge their advantage or their privilege. So really considering and was really expressing views along the lines of all lives matter. However, there were some white students who did recognise the privilege that they held, but didn't know how to explore this in a way that was meaningful because they were fearful of getting it wrong or saying the wrong thing. There was also something around the confidence for global majority students, that they felt that their contributions about their culture and their background were not appreciated in large group discussions, so they were quite reticent then to share their experiences. And some students said that they didn't always feel safe entering into these conversations, as some lecturers tended to take a hands-off approach, so tended to stand back and let the conversation evolve. And students felt that they wanted those spaces to be much better managed. Some white students also felt blamed and or guilty for the historical atrocities that they were learning about within university. So for some students, this is the first time that they'd encountered or were hearing about this stuff, and they felt that this was a burden that wasn't sufficiently explored. And so this led us to a staff team to really think about how far we went along with this in terms of white fragility and white sensibilities. And so nonetheless, we needed to consider this in future learning and teaching. And I know that Sue will say a bit more about this in the second phase of the research. So we also asked students about whether there was any areas of tension for them between their identities and the expectations on the practice learning placement. And some Black students spoke about the powerful stereotypes that they had encountered, and as a result felt that there was little interest in cultures other than the dominant white culture that was on the programme. So they felt that this meant that it was difficult for them to explore in any meaningful way any tensions that may arise for them in relation to their cultural background and the expectations of professional practice, because they were worried that they would be judged around this stuff, particularly in their academic work. And they certainly didn't feel that the practice learning placement was the space to be able to do this. They didn't feel safe in that space. We were curious about what students felt needed to be different, what we needed to improve. So in the first phase of the research, both black and white students felt that ideas of white privilege absolutely needed to be explored, but they felt that it needed to be explored by white lecturers, because they felt that if it was led by black lecturers, it was much easier for students to dismiss this as coming from a personal perspective and not from a structural racist perspective. And some white students acknowledged their responsibility to promote change, but they strongly felt that this needed to be modelled by white lecturers who really needed to walk the talk. So there was lots for us to think about and to consider. And so these were some of the changes that we made following the first phase of the research. Lots of things that we did. And one of those was to introduce the Mandela model into our learning agreement. So this is the tool that was developed by Prospera Tedham, and we introduced that very early on in our learning agreements as part of the practice learning placement to enable those very early stage conversations between practice educators and students to discuss issues of power and also to explore issues of similarity and difference. We also built into our Prep for Practice module within Year 1 designated workshops that at one stage were facilitated by Sue and Garfield to explore whiteness and white privilege, as well as providing more safe spaces for students to discuss these issues. So tutor groups were spaces that were encouraged, because that's what students were telling us. They didn't feel safe in any particular space, either in university or in their practice placement, and they really wanted to have these conversations, but needed to feel safe to do so. And we also introduced a specific essay at the end of our Year 1 module. So students were getting this stuff really early on, and that looked at issues of identity, so black perspectives, white privilege. So students had no option really but to engage in this stuff. We also undertook some training. So as Garfield said, we did some training with our staff, or a kind of awareness exploratory session for the team of academics. And we also undertook some training for our service user and carer group. So they are called Social Work Voices, to support them in their contributions to developing the curriculum on the programme. And we also reviewed our quality assurance processes, such as our practice assessment panels, so that we explicitly considered the impact of structural racism for those students who'd been referred to the panel, who were struggling or had been recommended a fail for their practice educator. We had some really interesting conversations and debates around that.
Moving on to the second phase of the research. This time round, we included practice educators who were involved in the course from the teaching partnership, as well as independent practice educators and university tutors, as these people had all been part of the changes embedded from the first phase. This was the quantitative part of the research. So we set up a questionnaire for this group, and there was the potential for over 100 respondents. These questionnaires were sent out in February 22, and we had 18 responses in total from students and practice educators. Not many, but this low response rate isn't unusual for questionnaires. We nonetheless received some interesting data, and Heidi will talk about this in a little while. I'm going to focus now on the qualitative part of the research with the students and apprentices, and we invited all students and apprentices across the 3 cohorts on the undergraduate degree programme at University of Suffolk. And we invited them to take part in individual interviews or focus groups according to their preference. It had been agreed with students beforehand that white students and apprentices and global majority students and apprentices would have separate spaces for the focus groups. Because of the small numbers of global majority students on the course, they opted for individual interviews. So the focus groups and the interviews were conducted by a research associate not previously known to the students to promote the students' sense of safety and trust in the research. And these were carried out in February and March 22. I'll focus on the themes for the focus groups and interviews now with this slide. Strong themes emerged from the qualitative data, and we can look at a few of these in the following slides. And these themes were broadly divided into what's working well, since changes from the first phase were implemented, and then what's not working well and what might require change and improvement. So, what's working well? There was agreement across the responses that the teaching was well delivered and discussions around racism, critical race theory and anti-racism were going well, with global majority students feeling their confidence increasing as a result, and also some white students realising their lack of knowledge and understanding of the issues. So, for example, just to give you some quotes, these two from global majority students. They all seem willing to learn about racism, and I think some have even acknowledged that they have been racist in the past. I think it's taught quite well. The anti-racism is brilliant, and it's made me realise that I have the right to feel the way I feel. I'll read out the other quote as well. I already know the history of it, but feedback from other students in my class suggests that they were never taught it, and it was an eye-opener for many of them. And so comments as well about the diversifying and decolonising of the curriculum from students also indicated that there were clear signs of positive comments about the attempts of staff to decolonise the curriculum. There was increasing confidence again for some students. This is again another global majority student said, I didn't feel comfortable before we had the modules. I thought, oh, what I say might be weird to other people, but then I became more at ease with my identity and culture after that lecture on anti-racism and black perspectives. So I do now feel quite comfortable. And I think I would be quite confident. Yeah, the lecturers have made me feel confident that I can do this. I'm going to go back and say that it's the empowerment we got from that lecture. So that's the increasing confidence and positive experiences from global majority students within the research. But when it came to white students, then there was a sense in some of increasing anxiety. One student said, sometimes you can leave the lectures, I don't know, maybe feeling a little down and like you're in the wrong a bit. I don't know, I just leave lectures feeling a bit disempowered, I suppose. And then another student said, I struggle to know how to put some things into words in a way that's not going to offend people. Now, importantly, she says, I think that's my struggle. I'm curious and I want to be curious, but I equally don't want to upset or offend. Again, that sense of anxiety about how to manage interactions with other students whilst in this learning. There were some clearly positive outcomes in student experience resulting from this increased teaching on anti-racism, as these quotes suggest. I felt quite isolated in a class of mostly white people until that lecture, but afterwards found that white students actually made an effort to hang out at lunchtimes. So I think it helped in lots of ways. And then a white student commented, I've learned stuff I never thought about before and stuff I should have been thinking about. It does open your eyes. So now we move on to what's not working so well. And one area was around group dynamics and microaggressions. And an issue that was raised consistently by global majority students and apprentices was a feeling isolated and excluded in small group work. One quote from a global majority student, this is the area of most discrimination. In the group work, you'll be surprised. Most times the black or the minority people end up doing their presentation alone. And I'm just talking generally. So because of that, you're always careful about what you say or what you do. As a minority, you always have to be careful. And another comment. There are many ways you see it, like when you come to the class, you take a seat. Nobody wants to sit next to you. Then they sit 2 seats away. This is so glaring. Now, this was an issue that came up in the first phase of the study and had clearly not been sufficiently picked up by teaching staff across the different modules and year groups. The silencing of global majority students who felt isolated came through in the data. One student said, "I guess being the only person of non-white heritage might make it a bit weird for me. I don't know if that makes sense. I think if there was a more diverse student population, then I would feel more comfortable in sharing my own ideas in class." And there was anticipation of racism on placement as well from global majority students. I'll say a little bit more in a minute, but there is prevailing whiteness in the county, and this led one global majority student to say that they anticipated potential racism on their practice placement. They said, "But because of my skin colour, I don't know, I just think there would be, some perception that I wasn't up to the job." And this isolation of black students compromises the safe environment that we were trying to build. And one student labelled their experience as the loneliness of one. And in this context, global majority students can be wary of speaking out and are effectively silenced. Just to say a bit more about Suffolk, and then I'll say something about recruitment in the context of what the county's like. It is a predominantly white rural county, apart from Ipswich, which is where the university is based and which does have a more diverse community. And recruitment for social work at the university has tended to be quite local. This lack of diversity has implications too for placements, where global majority students can find themselves placed in all white teams. This lack of diversity, with its significant impact on global majority students and apprentices, as in this quote here, "I just think if there was more diversity and they made an effort to look into why people of different ethnicities were not signing up to the course, then this would be a good thing." So this has clear implications, the localness of recruitment and the county and demographic, clear implications for recruitment and trying to recruit a more diverse student group. Safe spaces were an important theme in the first phase, and we have worked to improve the students' sense of safety in large and small group discussions. But in this second phase, it was clear from students and apprentices' responses that these spaces were still not seen as safe enough. Global majority students said, "I think if there was a more diverse student population, then I would feel more comfortable in sharing my own identity in class. I'm more confident to discuss my own cultural background in individual tutorials because I feel this is a safe space to talk about it. However, in group tutorials, because I'm the only black student, it's not so easy. I would not feel confident in a group setting because the other students cannot relate to me." This next comment is from a white student who says, "But I don't think that being uncomfortable should stop us. It's important that we learn about these kind of issues. So I would always write about it or talk about it, because even if I was marked down, then at least I would have learned about it." So one-to-one tutorials for some were seen as safer than group settings, and there were varying levels of confidence for risk-taking. I mean, that last quotation shows that student is willing to take risks to learn more about identity and racism and anti-racism, etc. But then what also came out was that some white students were managing their learning on the course, and I think this has been found in other studies as well. That the student said, you're encouraged to include your own identity, but I think you've got to be careful about how you do this. A strong recommendation from our first study was to increase the exploration of whiteness, and this has been incorporated into the curriculum across the past 4 years, as we've said. The findings from this follow-up study show that this has had a critical and significant impact on students' learning. As seen earlier, global majority students felt reassured by the exploration of white superiority and unearned privilege, which helped them make sense structurally of their experiences of discrimination and oppression, and has contributed to an increase in their self-confidence. The teaching of critical race theory, as seen earlier, was very meaningful too for global majority students. But their positivity can be compared to a mixed response from some white students. And the findings indicate a range of responses from white students, with some being able to rise to the challenge, recognise their privilege and own their previous racist attitudes, which will clearly benefit them and their practice going forwards, whilst others were less able to confront their own privilege. And these students tended to think that there was too much focus on black perspectives and white privilege on the course, and that their own sense of lack of privilege in relation to, for example, sexism and classism was ignored. Such responses to this aspect of teaching and learning demonstrate a range of positions, or, as social work academic Sukhwinder Singh has helpfully called it, different footprints that anti-racism teaching and learning leaves with white students. So, for example, again, I won't read all these out, but first one, sometimes these are white students. Sometimes you can leave the lectures, I don't know, maybe feeling a little down and like you're in the wrong a bit. I don't know. I just leave the lectures feeling a bit disempowered, I suppose. Because there is a lot on white superiority, and I don't think it's my fault that I'm white. It's not in political favour to talk about white oppression. It's all about Black Lives Matter at the moment. So I think that does make it difficult for some of us to bring in our own experiences. I also think that we should be encouraged to talk about our own oppression as white people, instead of there being a denial that this oppression exists. And then a final one from a student who was clearly reluctant, but nonetheless trying to engage, albeit maybe reluctantly. They said, I do it, but I hate it. So you can see there a wide range of avoidance behaviours and difficulties that students were sharing, white students were sharing. They're clearly in contrast to some of the other earlier comments that we've already highlighted, where it seems to suggest that those students, those white students, were embracing the new learning with different degrees of understanding and acceptance of white privilege, and that there is a continuum of perspectives in white students as a group, from denial or defensiveness through to openness to be challenged, that can lead then on to coalition and solidarity. And within this continuum, it suggests that some white students are nonetheless resisting important opportunities for critical self-reflection, personal growth and attitudinal and behavioural change. Just to end this really, Robin DiAngelo, as you will probably know, calls it white fragility. The deficiencies in learning about imperialism, colonialism and slavery in secondary education in the UK mean there's a lot of learning to be covered on the course, with some students feeling more fragile than others and less secure in who they are when confronting this new learning.
In the second phase of the study, we were interested to hear the views and experiences of practice educators as to whether they had seen an impact of the differences that we'd made to the curriculum and how they were experiencing the learning and teaching of students as part of that. And we also surveyed two academics, tutors on the programme, and that came out of this was that practice educators were really saying that they wanted to better collaboration between the HEI and themselves, and that they wanted this to look like us being able to share with them details of the curriculum that were covering the perspectives, whiteness, anti-racist practice, so that they were able to continue this within the practice learning placement. And encouragingly, many practice educators were able to give examples of changes of the curriculum that they had seen. So they spoke about actually those conversations being very explicit within learning agreements that they'd noticed. And one practice educator spoke about the fact that she had heard students discussing course content about anti-racism that had never been covered in her own social work training or in any postgraduate study that she'd done, including her practice education experience. Practice educators also spoke about a feeling that there was a need for greater CPD opportunities for themselves, and they felt that there wasn't enough of this. They said that they hadn't really received any formal training, but they wanted some, and they wanted this to be able to develop their confidence, be able to initiate conversations with students. And there was also a recognition that actually they needed to take some personal responsibility for this themselves as registered social workers. So yes, the organisation needed to provide these training and learning spaces, but also they needed to take some ownership of that as well. There was some criticism from both practice educators and tutors regarding the commitment that they felt existed from senior leaders in their respective organisations to challenge racism and support inclusive and diverse organisational practice and cultures. They felt that there, again, the region, this was across the region, not just in Suffolk, that actually was a dominant white culture that existed, and that maybe there was a lack of understanding of the issues and some resistance to meaningful change, preferring to maintain the status quo, really. And one practice educator kind of echoed what a student's experience was, that she had said that a black student in her team had changed their name to what they thought was a white English sounding name to avoid potential racism. Finally, although there was a recognition that there was an organisational responsibility, both tutors and practice educators spoke about there needed to be a shared understanding and commitment to anti-racist practice at a team level. So practice educators spoke about some of the challenges that were faced by students who'd been placed in the team when there was a lack of shared awareness amongst that team about actually what anti-racist practice was and what that looked like. And tutors also from the HEI felt that there needed to be an alignment across the team in order to best support this teaching and learning of students, and to we needed to explore this more as a group of academics. And there were some suggestions around what we could do collaboratively, and that was about having a central bank of resources that could be used across the region, so for both practice educators and for academics to develop and operationalise anti-racist practice and principles into very concrete experiences for students, and also some kind of mapping document, so practice educators were able to see and map across the course curriculum where this stuff was being discussed, so there was some complementary learning and teaching as opposed to overlap.
Okay, so I'm just going to summarise over the next couple of slides. Pulling the two studies together effectively, what we have determined from the second phase of the research is that white privilege requires more attention. You saw from some of those quotes, lived experience quotes from some of the students, black global majority white students, in terms of where they are on their journeys, but also where some of the practice educators and university tutors may be themselves. But in terms of classroom development, what we may need to think about is possibly having separate groups initially to allow people to explore and talk about some of those experiences, or some of their reasons for being cautious about talking about their culture, their ethnicity, their experiences, etc. We also need to consider group dynamics as tutors, to have the responsibility to pay attention, because what we do is set up the safer space. We talk about the safer space in terms of what can happen in here, what might happen in here, but what is not allowable. Perhaps what we're not picking up on are some of those microaggressions in terms of where some students and apprentices might prefer to sit, who they might not prefer to talk to or be involved in group work with. So we're going to have to take more responsibility to engage with that as a process. That's also underlined by Tam Kane's 2022 work in terms of investing more in those safe spaces. And that's for everybody, but particularly global majority students. We need to develop more supportive group cultures and safer spaces with tighter tutor collaboration, because what we don't necessarily do is talk about what happens in the classroom if we've picked up on anything, and share those experiences so that the tutor who might be taking the group later at the same day or later in the week or later in the same module to determine what might be going on, and to develop strategies on how to keep that as a safe space for everybody, including the tutor. Recruitment and retention issues need more attention. We do need more diversity on the programme, whether it be for students or apprentices. And that's, as you saw and heard, was a major theme through the presentation so far. It's important to the learners themselves, therefore it needs to be important to us and also to the university. And we need to develop opportunities to talk about and have more experiences or more examples of people's lived experiences of racism in the curriculum, whether that's from the learners themselves, from tutors, from invited guests, from our social work voices, group of people with lived experiences, etc. It shouldn't be something that we kind of water down. And again, that came through the research where learners were saying that would be a positive move. Additionally, establishing more positive group norms and expectations. And the suggestion is that this starts at induction in terms of reducing those microaggressions. And this is a really valid point because we don't really establish those group norms as early as that. Tends to be once the module starts, or more to the point, those particular sessions around Black history, anti-racism and white privilege are discussed. We've determined that anti-racism and Black perspectives are taught well, but there is a need for more diversity of culture, ethnicity and lived experiences to be included in the curriculum. We're moving in the right direction, we're just not there yet. And that again, this needs to be encouraged through the resources the learners access, what is spoken about, the development of the people who are supporting them in their practice placements, etc. Whatever responsibility we have, they also have to ensure that there is improvement for all involved. We need to continue to decolonise the curriculum. We need to undertake more practice educator training on anti-racism, and there needs to be more collaboration between the university, practice placements and practice educators to bridge that learning. It's not something we've kind of got right yet, but it is definitely something which is on the agenda. We need to kind of pull these things together. And finally, wider organisation and practice learning settings need to embrace anti-racism more visibly. That includes the university itself, but certainly the practice placements the students and the apprentices go on, whether it's local authority practice placements or whether it's within the PBI sector. It just needs to be that accepting and commitment. Those are our key references, and that ends the presentation.
Thank you to Sue, to Heidi and to Garfield for their fantastic, informative presentation that's illuminated so many kind of issues around anti-racism and the evaluation that they've undertaken within the University of Suffolk. So really great to hear that. And I'd like to hear now from our panellists. So coming first to you, Pauline.
Hello everybody, I'm Pauline Sargent. I'm a consultant social worker in London Borough, and I'm also the chair of the BASWA's Black Professional Symposium.
Thank you, Pauline. And Sarah, please.
Hi, I'm Sarah Brown. I'm a staff tutor and regional academic at the Open University.
Thank you, Sarah. And Diana?
Hi, I'm Diana. I am a social worker with adult learning disability in the London Borough of Sutton and a member of the BPS.
Thank you, Diana. And Jenny?
Hi, I'm Jenny Wallen. I'm the Quality Assurance and Standards Manager for Sheffield City Council and work within the South Yorkshire Teaching Partnership regarding student placements.
Thank you very much, Jenny, and it's great to have you all with us. So, in terms of the presentation, as I've said, it's illuminated so many things. Let's get straight into our panel discussion, and I know there's some questions that people would like to explore. So if we could start with yourself, Pauline.
My question is just centred around the expression from some students and learners at the uni around white oppression and how they feel about that as they align it with, our attempts to place anti-racist practice on the curriculum. So in terms of white oppression and the expression of that, how would the university address that in the curriculum?
Thank you for the question, Pauline. It's a difficult one. When you talk about matters related to race and racism, anti-racism, etc., where it's pitched and then where it hits, it will vary. Personally, for a person such as myself, a black person, global majority person coming from a anti-racist perspective, black perspective, for me, I've had to experience a lot of what I call moral injury. When I read the responses, and even when Sue read them out again, it's painful. It's painful to hear that it's almost like it gets flipped on its head. How I personally deal with it is almost like, okay, it's not my issue. It's for you to deal with. And I look at it in terms of, and this is how I explain it to students and apprentices, if you like, that we're all on a journey. We don't know where each other is, or like you've heard, have no idea, didn't even know about racism, didn't occur to them, didn't know about Black history, didn't occur to them, they weren't taught it, etc. Whereas other people are part way on the journey and some people are further ahead. What I've had to kind of come to accept and realise is that it's a slow journey. Understanding people's responses, if you like. So it tends to be around denial. Yeah, it's kind of like the first stage of that, because it's easier to deny an experience than to begin to think about, I wonder what that feels like for the other person. If it's not denial, it tends to be a level of resistance. And, there's this unwillingness, if you like, to explore the reality of what Black and global majority people have experienced for hundreds and hundreds of years. And even with everything that's presented to them, their comfortable place is to sit in that denial, because that is easier than facing it. The main teaching comes at year one, but what we have committed ourselves to doing is teaching a level of anti-racism across the 3 years, so that when they come to their final year, we're teaching explicitly around critical race theory. So we don't balk at their resistance, we commit ourselves to it. But for me, and I don't know if the others would agree, at the moment it seems like it's a team commitment rather than anything broader than that.
Okay, thank you, Garfield.
Thank
Really
you.
insightful. Very interesting. Like you say, it's kind of like the initial responses of denial and rejection and turning things on its head. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So, Sue, something to that.
Yes, I mean, it was one of the reasons why we put in our going forward recommendations about separating student groups out in those early stages, because our global majority students don't need to be re-traumatized in the way that Garfield is suggesting it impacts on him. And I'd just like to add in there, that kind of moral injury that Garfield talks about is something the university should recognise too, around what it's like for Black and global majority lecturers working in this area. It has quite an emotional impact. Not to say that it doesn't too on white people, but that's why we felt that it should be separated out, so that we're not kind of repeating trauma for people who don't need it repeated on them. And that then in those all-white student groups, where we can see, as we've seen on the PowerPoints, the sort of a range of responses from students, some more open to change than others. And as Garfield said, they're all on the different stages of a journey. But I think trying to work with them as a small group of white students, my approach, people might disagree with this, would be to try and start where they're at and try to, rather than confront and put up their defences even more, to look at, well, what are they thinking about? Why are they thinking about that? What does it do to them to think about something different? And try and explore that with them. Now, we have a limited amount of time on the curriculum to do this, and that's what partly worries me as well, because we've got students coming from an essentially white county, with experience of being a part of, racist attitudes, actions, behaviours, that they're coming these different stages, but we have 3 years with an already packed curriculum, and how are we actually going to do this? But I'm saying it needs doing.
Thank you. And Heidi, would you like to add anything to what's already been said regarding Pauline's question?
Yeah, I think it's comprehensive already, Wayne.
I see. Okay, thank you. Thanks for your question and answers there. I'd like to come next to Sarah for your question, please.
Hi, presenters. Thank you. That was a really interesting presentation, and I like the fact that the broadness of it, the holistic nature of it, I think was really important. You just mentioned there, Susan, about the what the county that you work within looks like, and this links to my question, which is around recruitment and retention of students from more diverse backgrounds. It's something that I'm mindful of coming to the Open University, where we only really have work-based routes, and this is where we see less diverse students, for sure, across the country in step-up apprenticeships. But because they're the only programmes we work with the OU, I'm seeing much less diverse group of students than I have done at other universities. And I just wonder what you think we can do as recruiters to work better with employers to make sure there is equality of opportunity on getting onto these work-based routes?
I think that there is something around the responsibility of the employing organisation, isn't there? So I think that's kind of what you were getting at, Sarah, potentially, because that needs to happen way before those routes come and hit the education providers. So there's and I think that needs to form part of that wider commitment from organisations in the way that practice educators were talking about from their senior leadership team about not playing lip service to this stuff and being quite tokenistic. It needs to be very robust anti-racist action plans within organisations, of which commitment to drawing in and also retaining, because I think we've all had experiences of colleagues from the global majorities who the retention of those staff, because of the racism that they experience in organisations, so they kind of will move up fairly quickly. So that would be my response to that.
Thank you, Heidi. And Garfield, would you like to add anything to Heidi's response?
Just to say, in terms of the work-based, I was the apprenticeship lead tutor up until beginning of last academic year. And what we concluded from the last round of recruitment for our apprentice social workers was that it needed to be more diverse. Out of the 17 that we recruited onto the programme, you could only put 2 into the category of global majority, which for me was shocking, for the team was shocking. And we've relayed that back to the local authority, to the employer, and just said it's essentially not good enough. You need to develop your practices around diversity and make sure that how and where you advertise and where you're recruiting from has that diverse element in it. But also in terms of the interview process yourself, are you subconsciously oppressing global majority applicants through maybe even the way you think about how we decolonize the curriculum? Maybe we need to decolonize the recruitment process, because if you're not giving those, what would be considered 10 out of 10 response because they're more Eurocentrically based, then you might be putting people off or putting people down in terms of their lived experience response, which might not be related to a white UK European perspective.
Okay, thank you, Garfield. Thank you, Sarah. And Sue, would you like to add anything to that question?
I guess only just to say what, in essence, I think Garfield's probably just said is about teaching partnerships and using what influence we have in the teaching partnerships from the university's, or from the course team's perspective particularly, and this research as well, to raise awareness, to change behaviours in order to, increase the numbers that come through. So we have presented the findings to the local authority that we principally work with. So, we will continue to push.
Yeah, okay. Diana, I think you have a question maybe that aligns with this.
Just to add on to, I think it was Sarah's question or point,
yeah.
And I know Garfield more or less answered it partly. But what I would think then is, would the research panel or the group of you be able to connect with the different sources of those work-based candidates, maybe panels, maybe special, and be able to share your findings with them so that they are encouraged to actually be proactive in looking at the diversity of the candidates they select? And it might be that they get a group of candidates but have issues with how they present themselves, the language, but that's not what matters. As long as what they say, they have the material, they have the potential, and you can see that they know what they're talking about. It's not about they've spoken, expressed themselves fantastically, which someone else can do, and they're completely rubbish when it comes to practical things. And I know this because I have a teaching background, and I have friends who consulted me on different things, and they keep getting knocked back. But I've told them, no, they're talking nonsense. You know what you're doing. You actually, and so through that encouragement, eventually they do make it where they need to go. Not many, but I think some of those are the issues that happen at those levels of selection. They go too much into the nitty-gritty of how they present themselves. That's no one will be ever as good as the local native English person or British person, but they can do their work if they know what they're doing, if they have the theory and all the rest of it.
Thank you, Diana, for your contributions there. Pauline, I think you have a point that you just want to make rather than a question. Would you like to make that before we come to Jenny's question, please?
Yes, so just to share my experience of candidates who put themselves forward or, express an interest to go on to the social work apprenticeship programs, we do definitely take account of diversity. We focus mainly on whether the interested person is ready to practice and to learn to become social workers. We tend to take those candidates from a certain level within the authority, which we call care management officers or case management officers, pseudo social workers. So they're actually practicing the social work, but they're unqualified. But I think my point also is made that the entire team that conducts these interviews, and I actually lead on our apprenticeship program, but my entire team is made up of those from a global majority.
Right.
So
Yeah.
I don't know if that makes a difference, but it must.
I'm sure that can't be that common either. So, that's quite interesting. So thanks very much, Pauline. Jenny, if I could come to you next, please.
Hi everyone. Yeah, mine is more a comment rather than a question.
Okay.
This research, it really resonated with me, this research, because we have had everything that students were saying about their experiences. We have had similar examples within our own teaching partnership, with examples of students that have faced racism from people with lived experience on placement, but then that hasn't been dealt with in the correct way, the most appropriate way when it's been brought back to the office. So whilst the student was, fully expecting that there may be occasions when the people she's working with, they were working with, were racist towards her, the support that they then got was not what we would have expected. We've had placement terminations from students where they have said that part of the reason is that they felt very oppressed in placement. And again, when you check that work, when you then talk and investigate that with the white practice educators, they are flummoxed. I don't know what they mean. I don't know how I could have been that way. So it is something that is, I think every local authority needs to really acknowledge that, as well as universities and the teaching element, that it is something that students on placement and workers, continue to face. It's not just the students when you're on placement. So we, within our teaching partnership, have tried to look at your recommendations. I was in agreement with a lot of them to begin with. So it's nice to kind of go, that's what it is. That's the reason why. And we've tried to start putting some of those recommendations into place. We've tried to take more of an organisational responsibility for teaching our practice educators. So we have now incorporated into our practice educator PEPS training a model that's called Equity Accomplice, which was devised by one of our HEIs, which is specifically around looking at and working with students and the people we work with around cultural competency, intersectionality, lived experiences. There's a whole model around where we create that safe space, and which also includes a visioning session. So, okay, now we've had these discussions. What does that mean for our practice? Where's our visioning? What we're going to do? And we are rolling that out to all our current practice educators as well as our new ones. We've started to look at, obviously, staff hubs, which we ensure students are aware of and invited of, which cover a whole range of different protective characteristics, not just Black or ethnic minority, but obviously also disabilities, LGBTQ, pregnancy, menopause. There's a whole number of them to support a whole range. So I just want to say that, I feel that your research is really important, and local authorities really need to listen to take it on board, and there are things that can be done to help with this issue, really.
Excellent. That's really encouraging to hear, Jenny, especially in my native Sheffield. And I was a previous employee of Sheffield City Council as well. So it sounds like things have moved on a lot since my time there, which is really good to hear. Selfishly, I want to ask my own final question before we end this panel discussion. I thank you all for your questions and for your responses. My question is, just very quickly, I suppose, without going into too much detail, what were your motivations then, pre-George Floyd's murder, to actually instigate this work, which, as you've already alluded to, takes quite a lot of energy, a lot of emotional investment and so on. So if I could just come to Sue first, please, because it was your presentation initially that I saw we have this vision to want to run this session.
I guess my motivation comes from my life in social work. I've never done anything different, and It's about about really wanting to do something about discrimination, oppression. I can probably relate some of it to my own personal experience as a white working class woman. I can see parallels between that, not the same issue by any means, but that I can recognise parallels between my experiences and of going through a university system as well. I started out in the early 70s when there weren't a lot of white working class women at university either. So, you know, it's about those kinds of experiences that have built up, you know, certain ways of seeing the world in me and wanting to, as Emma DeBeery talks about, you know, build solidarity with others who are coming from a different place, but with, you know, experiences and challenges in their lives that you know, that need confronting and changing. So it's a very unfair world out there. And so, you know, I have that quite passionate feeling of wanting to connect with others who are different but with some similarities, you know, and try and make for some real change. So that's, have I answered the question? I feel
I mean, that's music to my ears, to be honest. Similar approach to life, I guess, that I have, and maybe that's why we were sort of destined to meet as well. So thank you for your response. And Heidi, if I could come to you next, please. What were your motivations?
Not dissimilar to Sue. The reasons I came into social work 25 years ago was that commitment to social justice, and also, you know, white working class women, and thinking about some of those intersectionalities and similarities and differences around oppression, really. And something there for me around use of self being so integral to social work. And actually, when Sue and Garfield and I were talking about when we were marking portfolios, and students' identities just didn't seem to be coming through for us. So it was kind of well, you know, is there something that we're doing on the programme that we need to do differently to enable these students to bring their whole selves to the programme and to share their experiences, both to enhance their own learning and development as social workers, but also as white students on the programme as well, some learning there. So yeah, that's my passion too.
Oh, thank you, Heidi. That's really nice to hear. Again, you know, our paths have crossed in other lines of work at BASWA, and it's always great to hear from you and to work alongside you, so thank you. Garfield, if we could have you next, please.
I think my motivation is embedded in my own experience and journey as a student. I went to it was college back then in Greater London, and it was that which sparked me in terms of understanding who I am, who my family is, who my relatives are, who my ancestors are. It's that thing, I guess, where talk to children and young people, and they, you know, I got no idea of who I am, my history, whatever, apart from maybe what my parents, grandparents might have passed down verbally or whatever. Yeah. But for me, when I started my social work training, it was just like this whole new world. It was like, oh my goodness, I didn't know this, I didn't know that. What? And then it was, why don't I know that? And then it was, if I want to be a good social worker, I have to know that. And if through my own journey, then if going into higher education, if I need to know that, the people who I teach and support also need to know that. And why? Because it's about life. It's about how we, if we're trying to make a difference in people's lives, ignorance is not an excuse. When I was studying initially, I had a friend who was which was then Suffolk College, and we used to compare notes. My college, I mean, top of the agenda, it was called anti-racism, anti-discriminatory, anti-oppressive practice. That cut through everything. So whatever essay we wrote, it had to have an element of that. And I asked my friends, what do you do at your college? Nothing, absolutely nothing. It's not on the agenda at all. Mm-hmm. So I start to think, well, how come we're gonna end up with the same qualification? Mm-hmm. Or the people who come out of this college, anti-racist perspective, inbuilt, absolutely nothing. When I joined University of Suffolk initially, that's when I picked up on the fact that there was very, very little teaching on it. Having colleagues who were also motivated is what kind of then grew this wonderful thing we're seeing today. And it's that journey, feeling comfortable to be able to work with people who are on the same page. Maybe I shouldn't even say it, but even within a team where you've got social workers with many, many years experience, they don't even want to have the discussion. that was the biggest shock, I think, because I thought I was coming to this kind of wow utopia of everybody's cool and anti-racist, and you say that and everybody's going to go down with you, man, let's move this on, kind of thing. But what I was hearing was just don't want to know, except my colleagues, and my colleagues are the ones who took this onto another different plane for me. So it's been a brilliant experience.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that's a really nice note, I think, to end our session on. I really thank you for all your time and effort and contributions in this session. I hope that our audience have got a lot from it, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. All right. Thank you, everyone. So we had some shining examples of social work synergy and proactive anti-racism in that episode. I hope this energy and synergy resonated with you, and I think we can all learn some lessons from our special guests' research on anti-racism at the University of Suffolk. Here is an advert from my defunct newsletter, Wayne's Weekly, which summarises my views on the whataboutery and dismissive reactions that anti-racism sometimes generates. Thanks again to our guest speakers from the BPS and the PC and D group for all their contributions and input. And many thanks to you all for watching these Synergy sessions. See you all next time.